Coders. Let me ask you a question that has challenged centuries. What invisible force can bring down impossible walls? A miracle, an earthquake, or a myth that hides an eternal message? Because we are not talking about just any city. We are talking about Jericho, one of the oldest settlements on the planet, an oasis in the middle of the desert, sustained by a spring that never ceased to flow. In that place, under a scorching sun and surrounded by sand and rocks, walls rose so imposing they seemed invincible. Until the Bible says they fell in an instant. And that is where the mystery begins. Was it the hand of God intervening directly, an earthquake that coincided with the outcry of a people? Or a symbolic story designed to teach that true victory does not come from weapons, but from faith? Today, Jericho is much more than an ancient ruin. It is a battlefield of ideas. Archaeologists, historians, geologists, and theologians debate whether there really was a wall collapse in the Bronze Age, whether the Jordan Fault could explain the impossible, or whether the story is a theological code that hides more than it tells. On this journey, coders, we are not going to settle for easy answers. We are going to examine what the earth reveals, what history silences, and what faith proclaims. Walls, dates, geography, hypotheses, pieces of a puzzle that, when put together, force us to ask a greater question. Is Jericho the proof of a miracle, the trace of an earthquake, or the most powerful myth ever told? The biblical account. Coders, after opening the question of the mystery, let us go to the heart of the account in Joshua 6. An army of former slaves with no military power faces the fortress of Jericho, walls impossible to scale. But the plan they receive is not of war, it is a ritual. For 6 days they march once a day around the city in silence, while the priests carry the ark and sound the shofar. The silence and the repetition build tension. On the 7th day, everything changes. 7 laps, 7 trumpets, and a collective shout. In that instant, the walls collapse and the city is left open. The key detail: there were no catapults or battering rams, only obedience. The message is clear. Victory did not come from strength, but from faith. For Israel, Jericho was more than a military triumph. It was the symbol that the impossible can fall when the divine will is followed. The City of Jericho coders. After the biblical account, the question arises: what kind of city was Jericho that its fall turned out to be so surprising? Located in the Jordan Valley, 250 meters below sea level and barely 10 kilometers from the Dead Sea, Jericho was a fertile oasis in the middle of the desert, thanks to the spring of Ain es-Sultan. That resource made it a strategic point. Controlling Jericho meant controlling the gateway to Canaan and its trade routes. Archaeologically, it is one of the oldest cities in the world, with remains dating back to 8000 BC. Already in the Bronze Age, 2000 to 1400 BC, it had walls, towers, and advanced agricultural systems. The settlement was built on a tell 300 meters in diameter. Compact, densely inhabited, and fortified. Its walls were impressive. A stone base 5 meters high, and an additional 2 to 3 meters of mud brick wall with towers that rose beyond 9 meters. For an army without catapults, it was practically impossible to conquer. And here is what is fascinating. Although small, Jericho combined 3 unique factors: antiquity, strategic location, and disproportionate walls, that turned it into a symbol of impossibility. That is why its fall became more than just a military victory. It was the perfect stage to show that divine power could bring down what seemed invincible. The Walls and Fortifications. Coders, if Jericho was a strategic oasis, what truly made it feared were its walls. They were not weak palisades, but a work of advanced engineering for the Bronze Age. Archaeologists describe a slanted stone base 4 to 5 meters high, upon which stood a mud brick wall 2 to 3 meters more. Altogether, they reached up to 8 meters in height and 2 meters in thickness, reinforced with towers 9 or 10 meters tall that overlooked the valley. For an army without catapults or siege engines, those defenses were an impossible barrier. In addition, Jericho could withstand a prolonged siege. It had fresh water from its spring, and grain stores sufficient for months. In other words, an attacker had only 2 options: retreat or die waiting. Compared with other ancient walls, those of Jericho were disproportionate for such a small city. Uruk and Egypt had similar defenses, but in larger contexts and with greater technology. The surprising fact was that Jericho, compact and isolated, built such a fortress. That is why, when the biblical account claims the walls fell all at once, the impact is enormous. We are not talking about simple walls, but about the most secure defense in the entire region. The historical context coders, to understand the impact of Jericho, we must place it in its time. The conquest, according to the Bible, would have taken place between the 15th and 13th centuries BC. And here the debate begins. Some defend an early date, around 1400 BC, following biblical chronologies. Others place it around 1200 BC, supported by archaeological evidence of destructions in Canaan. In any case, the region was not a unified empire, but a mosaic of fortified city-states, each with its own king and its gods. Canaan was under pressure from all directions. Egypt still exerted influence from the west, while nomadic and semi-nomadic tribes pressed from the east. Jericho, in the middle of that board, was key. Controlling it meant securing the corridor between the desert and the mountains of Canaan. That is why its fall was not an isolated episode, but a strategic blow with 3 dimensions. Military, it neutralized the first great fortress after crossing the Jordan. Economic, it secured the oasis and the trade routes. Psychological, it sent a message to the rest. If Jericho, with its impossible walls, had fallen, no city was safe. The Archaeology of Jericho. Coders. We've already seen the story and the history, but what does the land of Jericho say? The site is Tel es-Sultan, a mound formed by thousands of years of human occupation, where several excavations have fueled the debate. In the 1930s, John Garstang claimed to have found a destruction layer, dating to around 1400 BC. Collapsed mud brick walls and intact grain storage, suggesting a short and sudden siege. For him, everything matched the account of Joshua. But in the 1950s, Kathleen Kenyon re-examined the site with more modern methods and reached the opposite conclusion. Jericho had been destroyed centuries earlier, and in the time of Joshua, it was practically uninhabited. Her report was a severe blow to the literal interpretation of the biblical text. Decades later, new research reopened the discussion. Some archaeologists found remains of collapsed walls and questioned the rigidity of the chronologies. Thus emerged an intermediate hypothesis that Jericho experienced intermittent occupations, partial reconstructions, and perhaps a destruction close to the period described in the Bible. Coders. The debate over Jericho revolves around one key point: the dates. In favor of the biblical account, archaeologists have found evidence of walls that collapsed outward, intact grain storage, and signs of sudden destruction. Against it, dating inconsistencies, disrupted layers, and the possibility that the city had no occupied fortifications during the supposed period of Joshua. The result is clear. There is no consensus. For some, Jericho confirms a historical collapse that could have inspired the story of Joshua. For others, the biblical text transformed ancient memories into a theological narrative. Thus, Archaeology leaves us with a paradox. The city existed, the walls existed, there were violent destructions. But the when and the how remain an open mystery. Hypotheses about the fall of the walls. Coders, we've reached the point where faith, science, and literature intersect. The great question is simple yet enormous. How did the walls of Jericho fall? The supernatural miracle. The traditional view. God himself brought down the walls in response to the people's obedience. Strong point. Fits 100% with the biblical account. Weak point. Cannot be historically verified. The natural event Jericho stood on a seismic fault. An earthquake could have collapsed the mud brick walls. Strong point. Geologically plausible explanation. Weak point. The exact coincidence with the seventh day seems too precise. The symbolic narrative, more than literal history. It would be a theological story. The walls represent the impossible overcome by faith. Strong point highlights the spiritual message. Weak point doesn't fully explain the ruins found, the intermediate positions, a real earthquake interpreted as a miracle. The natural event becomes a divine sign. Strong point bridges science and faith. Weak point relies on an improbable synchronicity. In conclusion, each hypothesis illuminates a different aspect. The miracle emphasizes faith, the earthquake gives natural plausibility, the symbolism teaches a message, and the mixed views seek a bridge between both. Yet, what remains standing is the same mystery, the impossible wall that fell in an instant. Comparison of opinions. Coders, we've already seen the hypotheses. But what do those who study this mystery actually think? This is where the debate truly heats up. 1. Traditional believers. For conservative Judaism and Christianity, there is no debate. The walls fell by a miraculous act of God. Strength. Total coherence with faith. Weakness. Does not engage with archaeological evidence. 2. Naturalist scientists. Archaeologists and geologists see in Jericho either an earthquake or even a legendary myth. They rely on data and the seismic fault of the region. Strength, supported by verifiable observations. Weakness fails to explain the precise timing of the account and downplays its symbolic value. 3. Modern theologians. They take a middle ground. Jericho may have a historical background, but narrated in theological language. What matters is not how the walls fell, but what their fall means. Strength integrates faith with historical criticism. Weakness may seem ambiguous. 4. The current archaeological debate, Garstang argued for a sudden destruction around 1400 BC. Kenyon maintained that the city was uninhabited in Joshua's time. Recent studies have tried to refine the dates, but consensus remains elusive. In summary, faith upholds the miracle. Science searches for natural causes. Theology finds a deeper message. And what unites all perspectives is the same thing: the fascination with a wall that 3,000 years later still raises questions, environmental and comparative factors. Coders, if there is a place where geography speaks, it's Jericho. In the middle of an arid environment, its spring made it a fertile oasis more than 3,000 years ago. And it still is today. Located 250 meters below sea level, with summers surpassing 40 degrees Celsius, 104 degrees Fahrenheit, Jericho retains the same image seen by the ancient Israelites, the city of palms in the midst of the desert. Its walls, built of mud brick over stone foundations, were strong but vulnerable to erosion, and most of all, to earthquakes. And Jericho sits directly on the Great Rift Valley, one of the most active tectonic faults on Earth. A sudden quake would have been enough to bring down such tall structures. In fact, some remains show walls that fell outward, something difficult to explain in a military assault but plausible in a seismic collapse. Geography also explains its strategic value. Controlling Jericho meant controlling access to the Jordan Valley and the passage toward Jerusalem and Canaan. Then as now, its location was both a blessing and a curse. A prosperous oasis, yet fragile before nature and always coveted by those seeking to dominate the region. Symbol and message of the account coders, beyond archaeology or chronology, the real question is, what does the story of Jericho teach? The account makes it clear that victory didn't come from armies or weapons, but from obedience. For 6 days the people marched in silence, and on the 7th, with trumpets and shouts, the walls fell. The central point is not how they fell, but who brought them down, divine power overcoming the impossible. That's why Jericho became a symbol of faith. For the Jewish people, it was proof that God was with them in the conquest. For Christians, an example that faith can bring down any wall. The book of Hebrews sums it up perfectly. By faith, the walls of Jericho fell down. Its influence goes far beyond religion. The walls of Jericho have become a universal metaphor for obstacles that seem unbeatable. From spiritual songs to modern speeches, it continues to inspire people to face both personal and collective battles. In short, what happened in the Jordan Valley transcended history. The strongest walls do not fall by force, but by faith. Coders. We've explored the mystery of Jericho from every angle. The biblical account, the city and its walls, the historical context, the archaeology, the geography, and the hypotheses. In the end, it all comes down to 3 interpretations. For some, it was a supernatural miracle. For others, a natural earthquake. And for many, a symbolic story that teaches faith and obedience. The great reflection is this: does it matter more how the walls fell, or what it means that they fell? Jericho represents the fall of the impossible, the defeat of what once seemed invincible. Today, centuries later, the echo of those trumpets still resonates in culture, faith, and our own questions. Because each of us, at some point, faces walls that seem insurmountable. And now, the question is yours, coder. What do you believe happened in Jericho? A miracle, an earthquake, or a myth with an eternal message?